Now, at that point, there's the trajectory of how life could have gone. If I was dumb enough to open the door, things might have ended up very differently. I might have not been sitting here, talking to you. So, if nothing else, the absolute best predictors of happiness, in my view, pick the right spouse, pick the right job.
Today, I'm joined by Dr. Gad Saad, author of the book Parasitic Mind, and also a man who uses evolutionary psychology and its crossover with consumer behaviors. And it's such an interesting crossover that he is one of the most featured men on the Joe Rogan podcast. He's been on there about 8 times now. Let's dive into this amazing video with Dr. Gad Saad.
So my name is Gad Saad. I'm a professor and evolutionary behavioral scientist and author, and a former illustrious soccer player. My scientific research is at the intersection of evolutionary psychology and the behavioral sciences. What are the evolutionary and biological drivers of our behaviors? I'm housed in a business school because I apply it in consumer behavior and economic decision making. So that's my scientific career in 2 sentences or less. I'm also an author who's written both academic books meant to be read by other academics and trade books meant to be read by the general public. My last book was The Parasitic Mind, which looked at how bad ideas can parasitize our mind. So I'm sure we'll talk about that. My forthcoming book is titled The Sad, S-A-A-D, The Sad Truth About Happiness, which looks at ways by which we can lead a content, happy, and fulfilled life.
Before we started this interview, I explained that I'm not from a highly educated background, and the things that fascinate me the most are those aspects of you, the intersectionality, is that right, of the consumer side of things and the evolutionary side of things, the psychology and evolutionary side, and I'm really excited to sort of talk about that. And I know it was mentioned on a few of the podcasts you've been on about sort of, is it nature versus nurture? And I want to cover all those sort of aspects, and hopefully we have enough time to cover it. But one of the things I wanted to start with is your background growing up in the Parasitic Mind. You talk about your childhood and growing up. And the reason I really want to talk about that is some of the subjects I want to cover is the social currency of difficult times and trauma and how people are using that. And I think in the book yourself, you explain that a cold reality of like what difficult times can look like. So what was your childhood like? And what, for somebody who doesn't know anything about it, how would you explain that?
So I was born in Lebanon. We were part of the last group of remaining Jews. Lebanon is truly a multi-ethnic, multi-religious state. Jews were always a very small minority, but we were around. And then as things got progressively more difficult in the Middle East for Jews, most of my extended family had left Lebanon. In 1975, we were steadfastly remaining in Lebanon. My parents were happy there. They were well entrenched within Lebanese society. But then the civil war broke out in 1975. It was a civil war that was in part political and ideological, but everything in Lebanon and in the Middle East in general is viewed through the prism of your religion. And so being Lebanese Jews, it became very, very difficult, if not impossible, to be in Lebanon under imminent threat of execution. So I went through the first year of an astoundingly brutal civil war. I mean, most wars are sort of measured against the backdrop of how brutal the Lebanese civil war. So if you talk about some crime-infested area somewhere, you say, oh, it's like Beirut, right? Because it was really house-to-house fighting everywhere, where people who used to be neighbors now became mortal enemies. And if you were Jewish, unfortunately, there weren't too many people who were going to be sympathetic to you by virtue of you being, as I said, Jewish. And so we had to leave under imminent threat of execution. I saw things when the war started, I was 10, but by the time that we left, I was 11. So during that 1 year that we were in the civil war, I saw things that 1 million people should not see in their lifetimes. We made it out from Lebanon to Montreal, Canada. Actually, and incredibly, the elementary school where I attended upon arriving in Canada is probably a 5-minute walk from where we are sitting today. So it's quite incredible. It brings back memories. So that's my Lebanese experience.
Wow, just to a punch point of that, in the book, there's a real. I hope you don't mind sharing this out of the book. Was a really cold story of there was a man who used to come to the house who would change the papers like. That gave me chills when I heard that story. Would you be able to explain it?
Of course, yeah.
It.
So that has become colloquially known as the pomegranate story, because you'll see in a second there are pomegranates that are central to that story. The reason I picked that particular story out of an endless number of horrifying stories is precisely, and I mean, I can empathize or appreciate that you found it chilling, because that's why I picked it, because it really captures, you know, the old sliding door story. You know, if the doors had opened or closed at a certain point, your life would have taken a different trajectory. That's literally what that story demonstrates. So let me kind of describe it. So in Lebanon, we used to have a gentleman who would come to the house, and you know how today you have kind of disposable papers that you, let's say in a bathroom of a restaurant, you can take disposable papers to wipe your hands after washing them. Well, in those days, there used to be a service that which this guy would provide, but the roller was an actual tissue roller, so that, you know, there was one in the kitchen, for example. And so every week or so, he would come back to take off the one that we've used and then put a new one. So that was our sole connection to this gentleman. He was just a worker who provided this service. On a given day during the middle of the Civil War, where no one would be walking around or driving because everybody's getting butchered everywhere, there was a knock on our door. And usually in the context of the Lebanese Civil War, in the middle of the night, a knock on your door is usually not a good thing. And so I went to the door and I said, you know, who is it? And the gentleman says, oh, it's so-and-so. I'm the guy who changed it. Open the door, I have a gift for you guys. Now, at that point, there's the trajectory of how life could have gone. If I was dumb enough to open the door, things might have ended up very differently. I might have not been sitting here, you know, talking to you. And so I said, well, what is that you want? And he said, so he kind of progressively got more insistent. I'm here with some friends. We have a gift for you. Open the door. So then I got kind of chilled, went to see my mother to call her. She was in another part of the house. And then she came and there was more kind of insistence, opened the door. Bottom line, we didn't. We called, so I'm going to say the word in Arabic and then I'll translate it. There used to be a police division called Satash. Satash means 16, which is like a division of internal police. The chances of them responding to a call in the middle of the Civil War would have been next to zero, because, you know, I mean, for them to even try to get out would be too dangerous. So we call these folks saying that there are some men at our door that seem suspicious. They answer, they come, and so now they all come in. The main guy who used to change our roles comes in, and the head policeman says, "What are you doing here?" So he says, oh, I'm the guy who changes them. We went up to the mountains today and we picked some pomegranates, and I've got some pomegranates in this basket. So the guy looks, and there were pomegranates. So the policeman looks at him and says, you're coming here with other guys in the middle of massive fighting because you want to give them pomegranates in the middle of the night? He goes, if I catch you here again, you know, there'll be trouble, you'll be in trouble, whatever. So then the guy, before they're escorted out, says, you know, I'll be back for you. And we left, and as I'm saying this, I've said it a million times, I've written about it in the book, I'm getting, goosebumps, because we ended up leaving Lebanon before he would come back and resume his visit. And so that's the reality that you face in a place like a civil war, where every second of every day there is death awaiting you. Now, I think what would have happened there at the very least, it probably would have been sexual assault, could have been executed, who knows. I mean, certainly at least those things. But death awaited every other minute of every day. So for example, there was a place where I would go out to play, and I actually talk about this in my next book, where I talk about the importance of play to the human condition, that even in the most dire circumstances, like the Holocaust, like the Lebanese Civil War, you have to instantiate your desire to play. So I was a kid, and so my parents would tell me, if you're going to play in a particular area, especially like when there wasn't a lot of fighting, don't cross a particular line, because the eyesight of that, if you cross that line, is where the snipers take out everybody. So I literally would have this imaginary line that I knew, because the buildings I'd be covered if I'm here, but once you pass that, your head is off. And they just shot everybody, I mean, indiscriminately. So that would have been another case. Another example would be, and of course I've got a million of these, some of these didn't even make it to the Parasitic Mind, so you're getting exclusive footage here. Another thing that we learned how to react to is when there's shelling, there is like a whistle signature that happens, an auditory signal. Depending on how, sort of you learning that signal, it either made you rush and kind of hide because that meant it was coming very close, because the shelling is indiscriminate, right? It's coming from all directions. So imagine that one of the skills that you learn as part of your daily life is to kind of hear this whistle that either says, all hands on deck, or don't worry, it's 3 streets away, you don't have to worry about it. One day, my mother and sister were heading off to, usually there'd be a ceasefire from intense fighting. Actually, that's when a lot of civilians would die, because the fighters wouldn't really honor the ceasefires. And so people would come out to get replenishments, like to get water, to get food, to get bread. So there was this long bread line at a bakery next to our house. And for whatever reason, my mother and sister had been delayed in going to the place. So this long line, a car had passed by and just mowed down everybody. So then they could have, had they left 5 minutes earlier, they would have been part of the people who were mowed down. So that was the daily reality. One other source of imminent danger was you couldn't really travel anywhere, because there'd be these roadblocks, these ad hoc roadblocks that are set up everywhere in the city, where the militiamen, depending who the militia were, they would ask you for, in Arabic the term is hawiyya. Hawiyya is it means like an internal ID card that everybody carries. It's like a passport, but that you carry inside the country. And what's written on that thing is, okay, your name and so on, but very prominently is what your religion is, because again, in Lebanon, everything is viewed through not just in Lebanon, in the Middle East, everything is viewed through the prism of your religious group. And so in our case, so the Arabic word for Jewish is Yehudi, but it was written Israeli. Israeli means Israelite. So it even made it more animus against you, more hatred against you, because it wasn't just that you were Lebanese but just happened to be Jewish. They put Israelite, because then that even cues that you're somehow not Lebanese, you're Israeli, which of course we weren't. We're Lebanese. Our mother tongue is Arabic. We've been in Arabic countries forever. So there weren't many roadblocks that we would be stopped at where we were going to clear that roadblock. Basically, it would be a bullet in your head. Now, usually it was the Christians and the Muslims that were killing each other off, because they were the two dominant groups in Lebanon. And then they had several factions within each of these groups. Now, the Jews were an unbelievably tiny minority, in the order of, several hundred, if not up to 1,000 at the time we were there, I think. So we couldn't even get into a car to go anywhere, because if at any moment some militiamen stopped you and said, "Show us your papers," we're dead. So it was a very harrowing childhood, but luckily we got out.
In situations like this, is is there a type of personality type that survives, or is it just human nature that they will survive? It reminds me of Viktor Frankl, like some of those small margins that kept people alive, or him alive at the time. It was so minuscule, but is it because you're constantly seeking to survive? Do you understand what I mean?
Sure. So I think definitely there are personality differences in terms of how you handle the situation at that moment, of course. But I think also it's how you handle that reality after you escape from that world, right? So one of the reasons why I think I have a great appreciation for life, which in a sense, well, directly relates to then my next book on happiness and, you know, a fulfilled life, is that going through these unbelievable stressors in your life, I think allows, and then getting out of them. Now you can wallow in victimhood forevermore, right? I mean, and that's one of the reasons, by the way, it's very difficult for people to cancel me when I take the positions that I do, because if they offer some boo-hoo-hoo victimology story, my story is likely to outrank yours. So you're not going to play the victimology game on me because of what I went through in my life. But I use that my history to lead a truly happy life. Now, part of being happy is just your disposition. It's about 50% of the differences in happiness. To your point about personality differences, 50% of your happiness comes from your genes. Some of us have sunny dispositions, some of us have gloomy dispositions. But that still means that 50% is up for grabs. That means there's still 50% of the mindsets that you adopt that either make you lead as good a life as possible or not. And so for me, yes, that Lebanese experience is part of my background. It's part of my regrettable history. But it also makes me wake up every day whenever I feel like being down on myself and whining about something. I say, I escaped Lebanon. Life is good. And so I think you're exactly right that there are huge differences in terms of how people respond to these stressors at the moment and how they respond to them retroactively after they escape from those positions.
This is a subject I want to cover a lot, just because I think it's definitely used as social currency now. Victimhood is used as social currency, and but I also see benefit in sharing, like struggles that you've been through can really help people as well. And for me, there's like a balance of not buying into either camp kind of thing and making sure there's a balance there. One of the conversations I have quite a lot, and it's something I don't know the answer to. Maybe you do, maybe there is no answer, but when trying to be successful or fulfilled in life, I see so many of those people have been through extreme hardships, difficult times, whether they went through them because it happened to them and it was illness, loss of loved ones, life, war, whatever it was, or they put themselves in those situations. Can you make up for not facing hardships by putting yourself through difficult times and difficult situations?
I mean, you certainly can seek stressors that make you more resilient, that make you more anti-fragile. You might have heard the term before. Certainly, it's difficult to seek stressors that are as shockingly traumatic as going through a civil war. But you're exactly right that facing stressors and overcoming them is really a wonderful way to live a fulfilled life. So I'll give you a few examples from my personal life. So I used to be a very competitive soccer player, heading to play professionally in Europe. And then one day on a whim, this was 1985, I decided to set some new goals. I would run at least one full marathon a year, forevermore. And then by the age of 35, I would do an Ironman triathlon, which is, sort of the ultimate long distance endurance test. So in 1985, with very, very little training for marathons, other than being a very much in shape soccer player, I ran the Montreal Marathon actually in 1985, completed it in very, very good time. Then I did it in 1986, but that's where the dream then ended. 1987 rolled around, and I thought, oh my God, this is going to be too painful to run it again. And by the way, that's coincided with actually the time when I started putting on weight. I I was a very, very thin soccer player. And then over the next 20 plus years, I put on quite a bit of weight. And then over the past 2 years, I've lost it all again. But that is an example of just deciding that I want to do marathons and Ironman triathlons simply because they are punishing. And I think I was excited by the prospect of facing that. I'll give you another example in a completely different domain. When I was looking for which subjects to major in my undergraduate, I always knew, I mean, there were really two, and I talk about this in the Parasitic Mind, there were really two things that interested me in life. One was soccer, the other was my studies. So I knew that, you know, hopefully my soccer career would happen. And then no matter what happened with my soccer career, eventually I would become an academic, because I was always also someone who was very studious. I loved the intellectual life. I loved reading books from when I was a kid. And so the idea of being a professor, being paid to just explore things, seemed always beautiful to me. But I didn't know which field I would study. And so I decided, well, what would be the hardest possible field that I could study? That's what I want to do, for no other reason than it would really train my mind, because I knew that I would spend my entire career in the intellectual realm. And so what better way to train as you would in a gym? Well, now I'm going to study the hardest possible thing. So what did I study? Pure mathematics. I didn't really think that I would eventually become a mathematician, but I was good in math. And so I studied math and computer science because it was the opposite of the path of least resistance. It was the path of most resistance. I could have studied an easier field and ended up ultimately perhaps where I did end up, but I wouldn't have challenged myself the most. And so I can look to many, many other examples in my life where I have imposed these difficult stressors because it just seemed like that's how I would benefit the most. I would overcome them and then win.
Do you think there was an element of that you went through a civil war and now you try and like almost get back to those difficult times to try and, this is from my own experience, from my own trauma. I feel that after it happened to me, I did the same thing. I was about 300 and something pounds, and I decided I was going to run a marathon. I went outside and just started running it, and it was very much to put myself in a situation that was very difficult to do. And I did that quite a lot after that, and it was almost like masochistic. Like it was. Is there do you think there's something to do with the fact that you'd been through such a traumatic experience?
So my intuition tells me that no, because I think it's part of my personality to. So in the Parasitic Mind, I talk about having this purity of spirit. That so the two goals, that life ideals that I adhere to, are truth and freedom, and so there's an element to pursuing these two life ideals that comes from a very pure place. So, for example, I'm pathologically honest to a point that it's suboptimal to be, right? So for me, if I take a path of least resistance, then I'm not being truthful to myself. I'm being somehow inauthentic. So one of the reasons, for example, why I hate the idea of networking, although I'm not suggesting that people don't network, is that, again, maybe it's a maladaptive thing. Maybe it comes from a very pure spirit. Networking has an ulterior motive, right? Like there is a reason why I'm going to this meeting, because I want to network with others. Therefore, I'm not just doing it for the pure joy, for the purity of doing it, and therefore I refrain from doing it. But that, excuse me, that ends up biting you in many cases. This is why my mother, one of the many wonderful things that my mother taught me growing up, one of the things that she told me is, at one point when I was very young, she said, Gad, you have to get out of your purity bubble, because the world doesn't adhere to your purity bubble. The world is gray. The world is not black or white. And so for most things in life, I think my purity of spirit has served me well, but in other places it has actually harmed me, which, if I can segue to not to engage in shameless plugging, it was just relevant to the conversation. In my forthcoming book, in one of the chapters, I talk about the old maxim of everything in moderation, right? The inverted U, too little of something is not good, too much of something is not good. the optimal point is, the sweet spot is somewhere in the middle, right? So for example, related to purity, I'm also a perfectionist. When I'm reading the final version of one of my books, I read it 90,000 times because I'm afraid that there might be a comma that's out of place somewhere. Well, that's misplaced energy, because I'm spending the next week rereading the book to find one comma out of place. So I'm already in the suboptimal part of the curve. If you're not at all perfectionist, then your work suffers. You don't care about details. If you're too much of a perfectionist, your productivity suffers. As in most things in life, the optimal is somewhere in the middle. So to answer your question in a long-winded way, I think my pursuit of stressors really comes from that purity of spirit. So maybe the Lebanese war added to that pursuit, but I think even if I had not gone through the Lebanese war, I would have always been someone who's constantly trying to challenge myself.
Okay, so then to I know there's not a blanket thing that you could say, like a blanket statement for this, but how would you develop somebody like, you know people like David Goggins? Like,
is he the runner?
The runner guy, yeah, like super tough. The runner guy, that's me downplaying David Goggins, but somebody with an extremely tough mindset, who developed himself. You know, he went through he put himself through situations. He went through situations as a child. How does that person become to exist? Like, is it they're already that way and it's already within them, or are they developed over time?
So that, in a sense, if I reframe your question, is the old proverbial nature versus nurture. And the answer, I mean, it may not satisfy your audience, but it's the truthful answer. For most phenomena, we are an inextricable mix of both nature and nurture. There is a nature element that sets the lever of where we are on a given trait, but then that interacts with the environment, right? So if you have someone who has psychopathic tendencies and has antisocial personality disorder, so that's his innate element, but then is raised in a uncertain and abusive environment, that's the environment part. Now you put those two together, you put gas and the match, now you even have a worse guy. So, you know, I think that very, very few things are strictly nature. Very, very few things are strictly nurture. And the question is how much each of those two has an effect. Let me give you another analogy. This comes from evolutionary psychology. So there's what's called the cake metaphor. So imagine I show you the ingredients of a cake before I bake the cake. Here's the sugar, here's the eggs, here's the baking powder, you know, whatever. Here's the butter. They're separate, right? I can see them, I can point to them. Now I bake the cake. The cake is one final product. If I ask you, please point to the butter, please point to the sugar, you wouldn't be able to. It's an inextricable mix now of all of those ingredients that make the cake. That's what we are. We're the cake. And nature and nurture is those ingredients that you can't really tease out. So I think someone like David or someone like me, maybe there are some life experiences that, you know, made us more desirous to pursue resiliency and so on. But I think it's already in you. Just like most things. For example, if you ask people, are you born a leader or can you train someone to be a leader? Well, you could send somebody to military school, to officer school to be better leaders. But ultimately, most people will tell you they can very quickly, even before they start their course, they can tell who is likely to be a leader. It's in you. Comedy. You're not going to send David Chappelle to a seminar on here are the 3 steps of how to be a better comedian. It's something that he has in him that's innate. So it's largely nature with some sparkling of nurture.
It's really nice to hear it, because I do think that it's traumatic experience amplify it, or difficult times amplify it, whether it is like cowardice, like maybe it shrinks you, you know, it brings you back in, or if it's bravery, it would like amplify it even more. Today's video was made possible by Mulliganbrothers.com, where you can buy the Inspire Change t-shirts and hoodies with the link in the description. But also the new Momentum Mori poster has just dropped. A poster that is a reminder that you are mortal. It has 80 years worth of tiny little boxes that you fill in that represent a week of your life. Mine is filled up to 30 years. And it constantly reminds me that I could die tomorrow and I better live my life to the fullest. And it does exactly that. So if you want to be reminded that you're gonna die, head over to Mulliganbrothers.com to buy the poster. But before that, let's dive back into this amazing video with Dr. Gad Saad. And that I do want to go on to that. Is I know you spoke about like cowardice, like how. I mean, can we just talk about it in general? Like, can you riff on just on cowardice? Yeah, just go for it. Go for it.
Well, I can link actually cowardice back to the Pomegranate Story.
Okay, perfect. Yeah.
Because that night when those men knocked on the door, my father wasn't home, but there was a male in the house who was a long-standing personal friend of my parents. He has since passed away. My mother went to that guy who was in another part of the house and said, why don't you come to the door? At least they will know that there is a man here. And he was, almost in a fetal position, being cowardly and not wanting to face the situation. And I remember my mother was kind of angry with like great disdain towards him. And I remember, I'm telling the story through the recollection of the eyes of a then almost 11-year-old. I can't remember if I had turned 11 or not, but 10 or 11. And I remember, thinking that's not a guy that I want to be, right? What an ugly thing to be. But I see cowardice on a greater level in my fight in the arena of public ideas, because, and hence the parasitic mind, all of these dreadful ideas that have spread and that have now parasitized every nook and cranny of society could have been averted if people had the courage to speak out when they were first exposed to those ideas. But yet the reason why those ideas proliferated so quickly is precisely because of cowardice. And that's why I always say, in a very serious way, that we should revise the 7 deadly sins to include an 8th deadly sin, cowardice, because that really is what, or you might, I'm going to butcher the quote, but I think Edmund Burke, the Scottish philosopher, said, all that it takes for evil to flourish is for good men to do nothing. Well, that's cowardice, right? It's a couple of things. It's cowardice. I'm afraid. I don't want to lose my job. I don't want. Now, if you're in the Middle East and you say the wrong thing, it's off with your head. In the West, if you say the wrong thing, well, we don't kill you, but we kill your career. We kill your social media account. We ostracize you. You won't get invited to the cool kids party. And so most people, being the cowardly folks that they are, they say, well, privately, Professor Saad, I support you. But they always write, as I'm always, I remind people that here's the general structure of the endless emails that I receive from people. Dear Dr. Saad, a whole bunch of lovely words, then last sentence, and if you decide to read this email on your show, please don't mention my name. Aha, there's your cowardice. And then I reply to them, usually very nicely, thank you very much for your email, that's very sweet to hear, blah, blah, blah. Don't you think that last sentence is why we have that problem? And usually, oftentimes, that kind of, prompts them to come out of their cowardly stupor, because, if you can't even have the courage to publicly place yourself next to the person who is taking all the risks on your behalf, right? Then you're a coward. And so, yeah, cowardice is a terribly ugly trait, which, by the way, though, linking it to that inverted U, too little and too much of something, Aristotle had actually talked about the golden mean. And he exactly used the something we're talking about now. He said, look, a soldier who is cowardly is a bad soldier, but equally, a soldier who is too reckless in his bravery is also idiotic, right? I mean, if you just run, to defeat 100 guys that are staggering you, because, well, you're going to get killed. So you have to have also some temperance. Therefore, there's a sweet spot. Too little of something, cowardice is not good. Too much of something, unlimited, reckless bravery is not good. Like most things in life, the top point is in the middle.
How would somebody eradicate a cowardly trait or pull away from being a coward?
Right. So it depends in which domain the cowardice is manifesting itself. In my case, the way that I try to break through the almost impenetrable wall of cowardice that most people exhibit is by, first of all, doing things like this, where you're constantly repeating that message. So at some point, I'm going to ignite the courage in you that's somewhere hidden. That's one way. But also by telling people that to contextualize their fear. So most people overestimate the extent to which whatever they're fearful about is truly, fear-inducing, right? You don't really need to be so afraid of the ultra-woke mob people who come after you on Twitter. I get people who come after me all day long. And I go like this. I have fun with it. I don't care. So, and that's why, by the way, in the last chapter of The Parasitic Mind, I talk about one of the prescriptions I give people is to activate your inner honey badger. And the reason why I use that imagery is because, for your viewers who may not know, the honey badger has been ranked as the fiercest animal in the animal kingdom. That's saying a lot. Now, that's, for those of you who don't know, the African honey badger is the size of a medium-sized dog, not even, right? So it's not that big. It's not that impressive in terms of its size, but yet it could withstand an attack of 6 adult lions. How is that possible? Because it's astoundingly ferocious and fierce. So that just the way it presents itself to the world, those lions say, it's going to be a rough fight. And it has all sorts of other weaponry that it can use, but it walks like it's 18 feet tall. And so, it's a never-ending battle to try to get people to get out of the stupor of their cowardice. But once in a while, you're successful, because I will get someone who writes to me and say, I was always afraid to speak, but, I went to the principal of my kids' school and I said, stop teaching them this nonsense, and I have you to thank. Well, I just won. I got one person to muster up their courage to actually speak to the principal and tell them that they don't want to hear about, sex stuff to their kindergarten kids, that's inappropriate. Well, what were you so afraid of? Well, they were afraid that it is wrong for them to do that. It was, they didn't have the confidence in their beliefs to stand up like a honey badger and say, no, you're not allowed to brainwash my child. You teach them math, you teach them how to read, you teach them history and literature. You don't teach them about, gay sex as part of inclusion and equity. You want to be involved in whatever type of sex, that's great, but do that when they're older, not when they're 5 and 6. The argument from the woke people is you have to get to the kids as young as possible, because you have to teach them about acceptance and compassion, and we're all of different colors of the rainbow. That's great. That's a wonderful message. Not when you're 5. And as a parent, you should have enough confidence in your parental responsibilities to be able to speak out. Yet most people are cowed into silence because they're not self-assured about their positions. Whereas if you see, my interactions, I'm someone who is very well modulated in terms of what I know and what I don't know. If you ask me a question now about the legalization of marijuana in Canada, I would tell you, unfortunately, I don't know enough about this topic to offer an intelligent opinion. Therefore, I'm humble enough to know what I don't know. On the other hand, if you ask me something that I know about, that I'm willing to defend, good luck to you if you go after me. Because I'm going to come after you, I'm going to come after your ancestors, I'm going to come after your descendants, metaphorically speaking. I'm confident about my positions, and I can articulate why I hold those positions. And so there isn't a one pill fit all for fighting cowardice, but at least in the battle of ideas, hopefully doing these kinds of conversations will encourage people to speak out.
With cowardice in particular, it's not just accepted, it's almost celebrated now, like it's online especially. Is that a threat to this, like the next generation, or the people that it's affecting right now, the people that it's accepted on, like this cowardiceness?
Well, look, I think oftentimes when, as you're saying, it's celebrated to not speak out, even if you're going to say something truthful, because it might hurt someone's feelings. So the currency that matters most in the general zeitgeist is that, don't hurt someone's feelings. This is why in chapter 2 of the Parasitic Mind, the entire chapter is about truth versus feelings. And I argue in that chapter, forgive me, I'm just going to do a little tangent, I'll come back. I argue in that chapter that there are two ethical systems that matter in life. There's what's called deontological ethics and consequentialist ethics. Let me mention each. Deontological ethics operate in absolute statements, absolute truths. So for example, if I say it is never okay to lie, that would be a deontological statement. If I say it is okay to lie to spare someone's feelings, your spouse asks, do I look fat in those jeans? Well, you might want to put on your consequentialist hat and say, no, you've never looked more beautiful, because you're trying to spare the feelings of your spouse at that moment. For many, many things in life, we're all consequentialists, and it makes sense to be. But for some things in life, as I explain in the Parasitic Mind, you have to be deontological. In the pursuit of truth, there is no equivocation. It's true or not true. I operate in the world, in science, I operate in the world of trying to better understand human nature. Now, if in the pursuit of truth, I end up uncovering a finding that might hurt someone's feelings, as I said famously on Joe Rogan, F your feelings. Not because I am a insensitive guy, I'm actually the opposite. Not because I'm uncaring, but because when I put on my hat of someone who is trying to create knowledge and spread knowledge, there's only one metric I care about. Am I being truthful? So I think oftentimes people, if they are tepid and possibly cowardly, it comes from a noble place. They're trying to not say something that hurts someone's feelings. So here's a classic example. Is it lacking in compassion to say that only women bear children or only women menstruate? Well, some people would say, wink, wink. I mean, we know that that's true, but why not just say that people menstruate? Because at least then trans women, meaning biological males, won't feel excluded. No, I can both be compassionate and sensitive without murdering truth. I can be fully, as I am, for trans people living dignified lives free of bigotry without having to murder truth in the service of that goal. I can walk and chew gum at the same time. I can support trans rights and say, no, only women can menstruate. So I think you're exactly right that oftentimes people are cowed into being silent and are celebrated for being silent because it's the sensitive thing to do. No, be a honey badger when pursuing and defending truth.
Another thing that happens online is virtue signaling, and I'm excited to hear the sort of explanation of this. The idea of virtue signaling versus costly signaling.
Yes, beautiful, thank you. So costly, let me back up and explain what costly signaling is. Costly signaling is a concept from evolutionary psychology and evolutionary biology. It refers to the evolution of particular traits in an animal. So for example, the peacock's tail. So the peacock is the male of that species, and then there's the peahen, right? The peacock has evolved this incredibly large tail that is cumbersome to carry, that reduces its survivability. Why? Because by having that big conspicuous tail, it makes you more visible to predators. It makes you less likely to escape predators because you're carrying this incredibly burdensome tail. So it doesn't make evolutionary sense for it to have evolved if it were to increase the survivability of the animal. Therefore, it must have evolved for another purpose. That other purpose is called sexual selection, which Charles Darwin had explained. He explained both natural and sexual selection. Sexual selection are traits that evolve because they confer reproductive advantage to an animal. So even though it might decrease my likelihood of surviving, it increases my likelihood of mating, because the females of that species will find that trait to be uniquely attractive. And so now we're going to come to costly signaling. Well, why do the females find it attractive? Because carrying that tail, it's actually an incredibly profound concept. Carrying that tail serves as an honest signal of my quality as a male. Because what is it saying? It's like a neon advertisement that says, despite the cost of me carrying this very burdensome tail that makes it more likely for me to die because I carry that tail, here I am. Therefore, it's an honest signal of my quality. Shouldn't you choose me as a mate? So in order for the signal to be discriminating, to have value to the females, it must be costly. If it weren't costly, then everybody could imitate it. We couldn't tell the pretenders from the real guys. So let's take that concept in the context of human behavior. Let's say you have a tribe where when men get of a certain age, they want to demonstrate that they are worthy of having access to the most beautiful women in the tribe. They're going to be good mates. Well, let's suppose now we want to create a rite of passage to differentiate between the weaker men and the stronger men, whatever strength means in that case. It might be bravery or courage or physical acuity, whatever it is. Well, if I said, do 5 jumping jacks, and that's how we're going to assort who's who, well, then every guy would say, well, that's easy, I can fake that. And then the ladies won't be able to tell who's who. On the other hand, if I can develop a rite of passage, as they do in Vanuatu, in the Pacific small island, where they've developed a ritual which served, by the way, this is discussed in my first book, The Evolutionary Basis of Consumption, 2007 book, a book on evolutionary psychology and consumer behavior. So they have a rite of passage, that tribe, that serves as a precursor of commercial bungee jumping, whereby they take vine ropes, you go up on a very precarious looking platform, 70, 80, 90 feet up in the air. They tie the vine ropes around your ankles, and then you jump off head first to have your head squashed on the ground. Well, that vine rope can, might rip apart because it doesn't have elasticity. So that ritual serves as an incredible, honest signal, costly signal of my bravery. There's no way to fake that level of bravery. So now we come to virtue signaling versus costly signaling. Putting up a sign that says, I support BLM, is an empty, vacuous virtue signal. Speaking out against Islamic theocracy while you live in the Middle East, that's a costly signal. Because boy, is it costly for you to speak out against things that otherwise might get your head chopped off. So in order for a signal to be worth your salt, it has to be costly. Otherwise, you're just, forgive the term, a bullshitter, a vacuous virtue signaler. And of course, most people, going back to cowardice, are very keen on demonstrating that they are virtuous and they are courageous and they really do care and they are compassionate, but they do so via non-costly signals, hence they're frauds. If you're going to truly demonstrate that you're courageous, you have to have skin in the game, and therefore the signal has to be handicapping. So that's the distinction between the two.
It matches up for everything as well, like just in a journey to be successful or to live a prosperous life, is like either you're doing it or you're not. Like talking about, and on social media, those lines are so blurred. Yeah. Like you could even say, I ran a marathon this morning, and you can gain value in that socially, and people believe that you ran a marathon that morning, even if you didn't. You can get, and there are like situations like that happen all the time. I'm trying to think of where to go next. The thing we haven't covered, which again, just to hear your explanation of it would be very beneficial to the video, is evolutionary psychology and what's the crossover that you have? Evolutionary psychology and consumer behavior. Yeah. So
talk about that.
Go away. Yeah, sure. Go for it.
So let me first explain evolutionary psychology. Evolutionary biology is the field that seeks to understand how traits evolve, behaviors evolve, using evolution, right? So why do humans have opposable thumbs? How did that mechanism evolve? Why does a particular bird have the beak that it has so that it is perfectly seems adapted and suited to get the nut from the tree that it does? And of course, Charles Darwin solved that riddle by demonstrating that animals evolve these traits through a very elegant process of evolution, right? When sexually reproducing species get together, there is a random mutation that happens with the offspring. If that random mutation has reproductive or survival benefits, then there is selection pressures for that trait to evolve, and therefore eventually all of the organisms within that species will exhibit that trait, and those that don't have that trait will die out. So that if a blue dot appears to be, increase my survivability, then with enough selection pressures, everybody in that species will have a blue dot, okay? Now, evolutionary psychology is simply taking those principles of evolutionary biology and applying them to the context of the study of the human mind. Why has our human mind evolved to be the way that it is? Why do we experience sexual jealousy the way that we do? Why are we attracted to sexual products in the consumer behavior setting in exactly the same predictable way around the world? Why is it men who largely consume hardcore pornography? Why is it women who will beautify themselves in a predictable way using cosmetics? Why are 99% of Ferrari owners men, even though there are countless women who are wealthy and powerful enough to purchase Ferraris, yet they don't line up to purchase Ferraris? So evolutionary psychology is the scientific study of the human mind using evolutionary principles to understand why the human mind evolved to be the way that it is. What I do is I simply take that framework and I apply it in the context of studying our consumatory nature. But I define, by the way, consumer behavior very broadly. It's not just consumption of Coca-Cola and consumption of Starbucks and jeans, but it's consumption of friendships, consumption of religious narratives, consumption of popular culture. Everything is consumatory ultimately. And so what I look at are the fundamental biological and evolutionary drivers of our consumatory nature. Something like that.
Okay, so what is happiness? Like, how do you quantify it?
Right, it's hard to quantify. I mean, there are psychometric tests that we could give people that measures what your contentment score is, or your well-being score, or your happiness score versus mine, to see who's more. And of course, probably of all topics that one could philosophize about, the one that has been most written about is happiness. The ancient Greeks, not just the ancient Greeks, but most famously the ancient Greeks have written endlessly about the pursuit of the good life. Almost every ancient Greek philosopher has weighed in on that. So one thing you might ask is, okay, what's another book going to say about that? Well, it's my unique life experiences that I'm bringing to the table, coupled with the science to back it up, right? So that's the unique experiences, right? I only lived through that pomegranate story that I said earlier. So there are unique insights that hopefully I can bring to the table. It's not, but unlike other people who operate within that sphere, I'm humble enough to not oversell the book, meaning it's not implement these 8 steps and I promise you a guaranteed life. All that I can say is, for each of those possible things that I'm prescribing, you increase your likelihood of being happy if you can adopt each of these, right? So it's not a guaranteed recipe and a guaranteed prescription for immortal happiness, but people have wisdom, people have knowledge, people live through certain experiences that they say, I think I can offer you some good, valuable advice as to how you can go from point A to point B, where point B is a happier state. And so it is a tough thing to do, and tons has been written on it, but I think I've brought quite a few new nuggets to the story.
So in that aspect, you are sharing some of your story. And this is one of the things that I think there's a sort of grey area with it, where people will share certain aspects of what's happened to them, or they'll put out a story online to gain that social currency, that empathy from people. When is it appropriate? Like, and how do you judge a situation to share your story to help other people? I mean, is that the answer there?
Yeah, I faced that exact dilemma, I think, on my last appearance. I think it was my last appearance. I think I've been 8 times on Joe Rogan. I hope I didn't miscount, but I think it's been 8 times. The last time I was on, I wasn't sure if I should share the following story, exactly to your question, and which is that 2 summers ago, out of the blue, while driving with my family, my children and wife, to go get some Peruvian rotisserie chicken, out of the blue, I started getting a reaction. It seemed like I was about to die. My wife took over the reins of the car, we rushed to the hospital. They did a battery of tests and said, "You're fine, you suffered a panic attack." And I wasn't sure if I should share the story because I think I succumbed to the wrong mindset, which is, oh, everybody knows me as a honey badger. I am someone who's always calm and relaxed, and I can take on all kinds of crazy stuff and go like this. How does it look when you share a story like you had a panic attack? Does that smell of weakness? Then I really thought about it. I said, no. You know what's strong? To actually share that story. To show that even the person who many people think is the ultimate honey badger, we all have moments of weakness. And by the way, there wasn't something in particular that I can think of. I mean, I could think maybe of a few trigger, but there wasn't something in particular that I was worrying about that led to that panic attack. It literally came out of nowhere. I'm totally happy. We're listening to music. I started getting numbing in my hands. My breathing became very shallow. And I don't know what happened. And then I got out of it. I said, well, wait a second. If I appear on Joe Rogan and I share that story, first of all, I'm living true to the ideal of authenticity. I didn't refrain from sharing that story because I want to manage an image of me as a superhero. I think it actually takes more courage to share that weakness. So to answer your question, I think we all struggle with that issue, which is how much of our private self should we share? But for me, someone who pursues truth, I felt it would have been inauthentic and untruthful. I'm not suggesting that every single story of my personal life I share. I mean, I don't share the intimate details of what I do with my wife in the privacy of our bedroom, right? That has nothing to do with a lesson to learn. But this seemed to me like something that people would benefit. And by the way, I did get, as you might imagine, when you're speaking to Joe Rogan with the size of audience that he has, I got many people who wrote to me and said, you don't know how much you telling that story helped me. And so that validated the fact that it was good that I got my courage to tell the story, because otherwise, someone out there that could have benefited from that story didn't.
Yeah, I mean, that is, especially online, especially in the position that you're in, it's such a grey area, I think, and it's abused quite a lot as well, I think, by a lot of influential people. For looking from the outside, not even this generation, but at the moment, what do you see as the biggest obstacle for the pursuit of happiness for people?
Wow. I mean, I think they are it's tough to say the singular one, but I think I could actually answer it. So in the way the chapters are structured in my next book, the happiness book, is one of the chapter deals with the 2 most important decisions that you can make that can either impart a lot of happiness on you or misery. And then the remaining chapters are mindsets that you can adopt in the pursuit of happiness. So I think that chapter on what are the 2 decisions that you could make, that either bring you happiness or misery, speak to your question. Can you guess what those 2 decisions are? Do you want to?
Not at all, yeah.
So number 1, choosing the right spouse, and number 2, choosing the right job or profession. And there's nothing magical about why those two are the most important. It's because that's where you spend much of your life, right? So if when I wake up in the morning and when I go to bed at night, the person next to me is someone that I really like, I'm on my way to being happy. If now between the waking up with that person and the sleeping at night with that person, what happens in the day, my job, I'm also going, oh, this is exciting. Oh, I'm talking to the Mulligan brothers today. Looks like a nice opportunity. I'm excited. Then I'm talking to Matt Letizier later. Then I'm going to work on some academic paper between those. There's a lot of excitement. Well, then I'm likely to be happy, right? A week ago, I didn't know who you were. A week later, here we are sitting in an Airbnb having this chat. So there is an endless number of ways by which I feel fulfilled in my professional life because of the profession that I chose. Now, there were elements to my profession that are unique to me, right? Most professors are not sitting with the Mulligan brothers because I opened myself up to many other opportunities. I was probably one of the first, maybe the first, or certainly the main recurring professor on Joe Rogan. There's been a few others now because I didn't view it, too cheap to go and speak to non-academics, right? So I live my life in such a way that my professional trajectory is one that brings me great happiness. Now, you might say, okay, well, but what is the secret? How can I know what's going to make me happy? How can I know whether the person that I choose, I mean, we all start off our marriage hoping that it will last forever, and then 50+% end up in divorce. So how can we know? Well, there is no absolute guaranteed prescription. But there are certainly a lot of rules of thumbs, let's say in choosing the optimal spouse for you, that will either greatly increase your likelihood of success or greatly reduce it. So here is one. So there are two, if you like, truism when it comes to, birds of a feather flock together or opposites attract. What makes for a better relationship when you choose someone who is as similar to you as possible, or if you choose someone who is different from you, so you complement each other. And the unequivocal research findings are that for long-term success of a relationship, like a marriage, birds of a feather flock together. Now you might say, well, but on which metric should we be similar? Your life values, your goals, your belief systems, right? So if you choose some, right? We often are very sexually attracted to someone, even though the reality is we have very little in common with, but yet we are blind to the stuff that we are different on because for now, our hormonal drivers, our libidinal drivers are driving the train. But guess what? 5 years, 6 years, 8 years, 10 years into that marriage, I can assure you that those hormonal drivers, not that you're not going to be attracted to your partner anymore, but they're not going to be the same. You're not going to get the same butterflies in your pit of your stomach. You're not going to get skin conductivity when you see them. There'll be something else that comes. There'll be contentment in seeing them. There'll be serotonin release. You're happy when you see this person, right? I go out there, fight the world, but then when I go home, there's the beautiful smile of my wife there. So there are rules of thumbs that I can instantiate that increase my chances of being happy with my wife, with my spouse or my job. So if nothing else, the absolute best predictors of happiness in my view, pick the right spouse, pick the right job. The two decisions that are most likely to impart the greatest amount of happiness or the greatest amount of misery in your life are choosing the right spouse and choosing the right job.
If you was to direct somebody right now to sort of your teachings, sort of where they can learn more about you, where would you direct them and what's the next sort of resources they can find?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. So I have a show called The Sad Truth, SAAD, where I either post lectures that I've delivered. It could be 5-minute rants. Something pissed me off on television. I turn on the laptop and I just talk into the camera. It could be long form chats. So, I've been doing long form chats now since 2014. Certainly one of the early ones, and certainly as one of the only professors who does this. I've had people of all walks of life. In other words, I don't only speak to other professors I can speak to a comedian, I could speak to an actor, I could speak to a lawyer, a diplomat, of course, academics, philosophers. All that I care about is, do I think that this person will be someone who's going to be interesting, that the viewers are going to be happy to listen to. So that's the sad truth. It used to be only on my YouTube channel, but people kept saying, you know, you need to have a footprint in the auditory world and podcast. So 2 years ago, I started posting everything also on my, you know, podcast platform, which gets delivered everywhere, Apple and Spotify and everywhere. That's also the sad truth with Dr. Saad. So that's one. I also have a very active social media platform. At Gad, Gad, is my Twitter handle. I also have a public Facebook page and an Instagram page. But I think I'll need to offline, off the camera, find out your secrets for how you can grow so big, because it seems, I don't know if I'm being shadow banned, but certainly, for example, on Facebook and on Instagram, my follower count has been at exactly the same number, in one case for 6 months, in one case for 2 years, and it never, ever grows. So it has to be that they're...
It happens, yeah.
Yeah, so those are the ways that people can reach me.
Okay, and the last question that I usually ask to everybody is, if you could give one piece of advice to a younger version of yourself, or just a young person growing up right now, what would it be?
I would say, which actually is one of the chapters in the happiness book, is try to live your life in such a way that you minimize the future prospect of regret. So what you don't want to do is wake up when you're my age now and say, I don't know why I ever became an accountant, because I did it because my dad said it was the right thing to do, and I come from a family of accountants, but I always wanted to be an artist. I always wanted to be a physician. So there's nothing that gnaws at the pit of your stomach more than, you know, retroactive regret, right? And so really try to live your life, and there's a term actually, it's called anticipatory regret. Anticipate what your future regret might look like, and then live your life in a way that tries to minimize that. So for example, in my case, even though I had very little power in controlling it, my biggest regret, and certainly whenever the World Cup comes around, is that I never had the fortune of knowing what it is to step on a field when the entire world is there watching, and for you to perform on a world stage. I so regret that in my life, I will never, you know, the most I've played in front of is maybe 2,000 people. So the idea of playing in front of 100,000 crowd seems so magical and mystical to me. I regret that I never had the opportunity to do that. So live your life in a way, grab life by the horns of the bull, so to speak, and don't regret, because that gnaws at your spirit.
I love that answer, and I know I said that was the last question. The last one, I just want to wrap it off, because it just reminded me of the talking point you had with Tom, which was when you put your head down on the pillow at night. Yes. And it's similar kind of theme. Like, if you could just explain that to the viewers, and then we'll wrap it up there.
Sure. So that answer, if I remember correctly, with Tom, and I think I've given it with others, is usually when people say, you know, why is it that you are such a dogged, you know, defender of the truth? Why do you lead a busy life as a professor? Why do you get into the mud with all these people on social media and do what you do? And then my answer, the pillow answer, is, you know, when I put my head on the pillow to sleep at night, you know, I have a very exacting code of personal conduct, which speaks to what we talked about earlier, the purity of spirit, the purity bubble. And that is that I want to, in order for me to sleep at night and not have bouts of insomnia, bouts of being a fraud, thinking that you're a fraud, is that I have to be fully authentic and always defending truth wherever I see a violation of truth. If I walk away from it, if I equivocate, if I say, would it be good for my career if I speak out or not? All I see, rightly or wrongly, that's fraudulent. You're not being truthful. You're not being a honey badger. And therefore, for me to be able to sleep like a baby at night, at the end of the day, I do a mental accounting of, was I true? Was I authentic? If yes, I'm sleeping well. If no, I'm going to be up forevermore. And therefore, I always act in a way that honors my code of personal conduct.
Thank you so much for today. I cannot thank you enough. Thank you so much to Dr. Gad Saad for this. If you want to buy his book, I'll put the link down in the description. And if you're an Audible member, you can also get The Parasitic Mind on audible.com with the link in the description. And I believe it's free. It was free for myself anyway, and I listened to the book. He has some fascinating stories in there. Today's video was made possible at Mulliganbrothers.com, where you can get the Inspire Change t-shirts and hoodies, but also the all-new Memento Mori poster to remind you that you are mortal. It's 80 years of tiny little squares plotted out in a frame, in a beautiful frame, and you cross out each little box, and each little box represents a week of your life. I have 30 years all plotted on there, and it's on my fridge every morning I wake up, I come and see it, and I cross it off once a week, and I'm reminded that one day I'm not going to fill in one of those boxes. And that's a stark reminder to look at every single day. And I tell you, it's been the most successful tool for me over this last year. So if you want to buy that, go down to the link in the description and use code STOIC for 10% off. Guys, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.